All right, so working on the beetle again. Today didn't do as much, but worked on the fuel pump and the alternator. And so a couple of things to talk about there. Um, as you can see here, we got kind of a mock-up here of things. It's the intake manifold here is just kind of sitting there. As you can see, I can move it back and forth. We just kind of wanted to see how things were going to go together, and kind of see how everything fits. And what you'll notice is that there are it's a really tight fit. Very little clearance on certain things, and so really the only thing that's kind of all together, as you've seen, is all the cylinders, heads, distributor, and everything. Now, let me tell you about the distributor. I don't know if I talked about this in a prior video, but we're using this is a Pertronics vacuum advance centrifugal distributor. So this isn't like your traditional distributor. And so what you'll notice when you go in with the distributor, the shaft on the end of the distributor, there's a notch that sticks out, and it's offset. It's not dead center. You got your circle, and then it's not dead center. It's actually off to one side, and so that matches the distributor shaft that's down all the way down in here, and it's got a gear on it that presses against another gear that's on the crankshaft. So as the crank turns, it turns your distributor shaft, which causes your kind of rod up here to spin and hit all your firing plugs and that sort of thing. So what we found out as we were going through this, and I'm glad we found it, was that your distributor shaft, there's a notch down in the shaft to match the notch that sticks out on the distributor itself. That shaft has to be perpendicular to your case line. As you can see here, it might be a little difficult because we got it all put together. But this center point, this is where your two case halves go together. And when you stick this shaft down in here, it's going to be facing kind of this direction. You'll be looking at it kind of from this angle. And on that notch needs to be perpendicular to the case line. So it needs to be this direction. It doesn't need to be turned this way or with it. It actually needs to be perpendicular, or as close to perpendicular as possible. If it's off just a little bit, I think that's fine just because of the way your crank is turned. But you want to get that perpendicular because of the way that your vacuum advanced distributor works. Now, ours was actually 180 degrees out. So instead of it being perpendicular, and the other thing is because that notch is offset, you've got a bigger side to the circle and a smaller side to the circle. And you want the smaller side over here towards your pulley that goes there. So perpendicular to the case, smaller side closest to the pulley. Ours was 180 degrees out, so we actually had to take the distributor out, and then that notch, basically we used a really big wide chisel to stick down in there, like a flathead screwdriver. We didn't have a flathead that big, so we stuck this chisel down in there to fit. And then used a magnet, on the end of a magnet wand like that. As you can see, it's grabbed that. So used that to reach down in there, grab a hold of the distributor shaft, and pick up on it. Now, if it's not completely clean on the shaft and on the kind of this hole that it goes down into, then you're going to have some difficulty pulling it up and trying to get it out. And so ours, we had to kind of twist back and forth on it to kind of wiggle it and pull upward pressure on that magnet in order to get it up high enough in order to be able to spin the shaft. Now, you have to be really careful because on the other end of it are some shims. And if you come up too high, those shims could fall out and fall down into your case, and then you're having to, you know, break everything out just to go get those 2 shims, which would just be a huge pain. So you have to be real careful about that. So when you're putting your motor together, some books say that this is the last thing that you're supposed to do, where you stick a pencil down in there and put the shims on top and all that kind of deal. Our local bug guy, he said this is the first thing that you do before you put your crank or your cam or anything in. You put that shaft in, make sure it's facing the right direction. And as you're going through some of this stuff, you're going to be turning your turning your crank and making sure things are timed and everything. So you have to go back and check and recheck to make sure everything is timed right and in the right way. But we did get that, and then what ends up happening, and you know what, I'll show you here, is once you've got top dead center on number 1, so it's going to be number 1 on the compression stroke, top dead center, when you take off, and I think this is still on where it's supposed to be. Let's see if it is. No, it's not. When you're on top dead center of number 1, your post here will be turned around and it will be pointing towards this bolt here on your fuel pump. And so that's the way that you know that you're where you need to be. So again, when you're on top dead center, number 1 on the compression stroke, this will be spun around to your post here on your fuel pump. So that's it for the distributor. We got that in and set up right. Then we moved on to our fuel pump. Now, depending on if you're going to have a generator or an alternator, there's a couple of things that have to happen. If you're going to have an alternator like this guy over here, as you can see, we got a steel on it. It's kind of dirty. It's chrome, as you can see. But we got a steel. This is a single post alternator. So single post alternator, which is definitely preferable. Because it's an alternator, 2 things are going to happen. One, you're going to have a different alternator mounting stand, as you see here. And I'll talk about that in a second. The other thing is your fuel pump. Now, they've got a generator fuel pump that looks a little bit different. It actually sits a little bit higher. And then you've got an alternator one that actually is almost identical to the generator, except for it's kind of cocked out about 15 degrees. And then you've got this kind that I have here, which is a universal, so it's a little bit shorter. So as you can see here, it's a little bit shorter stand. This, on some of the other ones, this portion right here will actually be almost as large as this portion. So that's kind of the first thing. You have to have a different kind of fuel pump in order to use an alternator. As you can see here, this is the original fuel pump. And as you see, it's actually sits up a little bit higher than that. You can see how big it is. It's just it'll get in the way if you're using this alternator. The alternator. So, anyways, the fuel pump. The second thing with the fuel pump, I'll pull this off, maybe. Yeah, pull this out. Set this off to the side. You've got this flange, this piece right here, that basically is just a plastic flange that sits down. It's got and you know what? Actually, I'll go ahead and, if I can do all this. I'm going to pull the rod out. This is the rod. We'll talk about that in a second. Then you got your flange. If I can pull this out. As you can see, it's got kind of this flange that fits down in there, and that's where the rod fits down into your motor there. So this sits down in there. You got you'll have a gasket. You have to put sealant on the case, and then the gasket, and then sealant on top of that, or on the bottom of your flange here, and then stick that in. It'll go in a second. And then you've got gaskets. You'll fill this with grease, from what I'm told. And then you've got your gaskets that go on top. Now, when you put your fuel pump on, depending on what kind of rod that you got, they have different lengths rods. You got a long rod and a short rod. We ended up actually having a long rod, and instead of having to purchase a short rod, we just looked to see, okay, what's the length of the short rod, and we ground down the end, as you can kind of see there. So we ground it down to the right length. The pointed end, you'll want to put lube on this on your final assembly. It'll go down, and that ends up riding. There's a cam that is on the distributor shaft, and that rides on that cam. And as your engine kind of turns over, that cam spins, and it's kind of off-centered as it comes around, and that ends up pushing that rod up and then letting it fall down and up and down sort of thing, so it pumps your fuel. So that is your fuel pump. Now, as I mentioned, you have to have a different stand for use with an alternator, and I'll show you the original. Here is the original. That's the generator stand, as you can see, as opposed to the alternator stand. As you can see here, this is offset. It's pushed back. All this clearance right here is much less than the clearance on that. We actually found this out the hard way, because we started putting on the fan shroud and the alternator, only to find out that it just wasn't lining up. So come to find out, you do have to have a different stand for your alternator. The one thing that we are going to have to save is this breather that is on top right here. This guy right here, it's got a breather that's just that just hangs down. This has a bolt in it that I believe is this right here. Yep, this is it. As you can see, it's got 2 notches. And this is real sensitive, because this ends up fitting down in here and screwing in, and it ends up screwing this breather cap. This is where you're going to fill your oil. That's going to screw on to right here. And man, these things are just incredibly difficult to take off. Like, we couldn't, as you can see, it's loose, but we could not get that bolt, that original bolt, out of this guy. I mean, it was just rock solid in there. So fortunately, we were able to find another one of these breathers at our local parts guy, which, on another note, man, if you can, find a local parts guy. I mean, our guy here, Don's Buggy Stuff, he's here outside of Gadsden, Alabama. Man, he has really saved the day with us. And he's got new stuff, he's got used stuff, he's got a boneyard that you can go out and pull parts off of and get stuff, dirt cheap, which is nice. So definitely, if you're in the area, look him up, and look him up online. You might even give him a call, and he can maybe ship stuff to you. So anyways, find a local guy. And so he had in his boneyard, he had a couple of these that was just it by itself. And so we'll end up taking that and cleaning it up. A lot of those used parts, and I'll show you some. You've probably seen some of this work that we've done with the electrolysis. I'm trying to find something that is actually dirty, but we've been cleaning stuff up so much. I'll show you this. So this is our flywheel. Now, we cleaned the flywheel, but we didn't just take a wire brush to everything on it. So you see it's a little bit darker. Now, this right here is the basically your oil cap on the bottom of the engine down here. And man, this thing was darker than that right there, especially on this side too. Way darker. And as you can see, we put it through the electrolysis, which is happening over here. If I hold still, you can see how the water's moving. Basically what it's doing is it's pulling the rust off the parts that are in that. If you're not familiar with that, all it is just a big old tub of water with, I think we've got some Arm & Hammer baking soda, superwash powder down in it. Got some metal, as you can see, that metal mesh on the side, or you can put rods. You can see that bucket over there's got rods. And you just electrify it. You stick the negative to whatever you're wanting to take the rust off of, and the positive to that mesh. And as you can see, it's stirring the water there and bubbling, and it's pulling all that rust off. And so what ends up happening is it ends up coming pretty close to this. You can see some spots kind of right here in the middle. That's about what it looked like. And then we put it in our parts washer over there just to kind of get some, I think Super Purple is what we're using. And then took a wire wheel, like this guy, this right angle guy with a wire wheel to it, and it shines right up. And so it's ready for painting. We do that to all the parts, even these little castle nuts that end up going on for that. So